And now, Alan Blanchard presents Fight Camp, an optative education.
Right then, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever time you're listening. My name is Alan Blanchard. I am the podcast enhancer, the one and only podcast enhancer, and this is my new show called Fight Camp, an octagon education. A little show from me to you, the new UFC fan who needs a little bit of guidance and just some information about this new, this 20-year-old up-and-coming sport that is taking over the world. I'm just a fan, just a regular fan. I've been a fan for a long time. I'm not a bloody journalist or an expert or claiming to be an expert. I'm just someone that wants to pass on information that I've got by just loving this sport, mixed martial arts, and of course the biggest brand in the world, the UFC. Now, you might think, how the hell did this come about? How did this bold, four-eyed geek come about talking about UFC? And it's because I do a show from the podcast still, a show called the Midweek Wrestle Chat, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I've been in and around the wrestling industry for a long, long time. So I do this show with my good friend Tony James. Now, Tony's brilliant, massive wrestling fan. We've done loads of stuff in the past. We do the show. It's been very successful, and we're really proud of it. Now, as the show adapted and changed through the 18 months we've been doing it, UFC has become quite a big part of the wrestling world in its own little genre. And so I got given this little segment in the show called the MMA Roundup, where I talk about the latest news and just the big fights that have come up in UFC. Because a lot of the fans are fans of both. And we understand, yes, wrestling isn't the same as UFC. It's a different product aimed at a different audience, but there is a similarity, and fans like the both. UFC fighters like WWE, WWE like UFC. So there we go. So because of my MMA Roundup on the Midweek Wrestle Chat, I get asked a lot of questions on Twitter, on Facebook, on other random things that people ask me questions about UFC, and I try my very best to answer them. I'm normally putting them in the right direction, I feel. So after begging and pleading with the podcast hut, I said, can we have a little show that's dedicated to the new MMA fans, the new fans of the UFC, that I can just help pass my little bit of knowledge on? And they said, you must be flipping joking, you're a bumbling idiot. So I begged a bit more, and I pleaded a bit more, and they gave in just because of the sheer volume of my begging. So here we are. This is my first episode, and my first show. I'm very proud to be doing it. I'm very chuffed that they're supporting me. So let's get the show on the road, and we'll start off with a little bit of basics about the UFC and MMA. Now, the first thing we need to understand is what is the UFC. Now, the UFC is the company, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Now, they are the company, they're not the sport, they're the company, they are the brand that produce and show these shows and put on the sport and host MMA. Now, MMA stands for Mixed Martial Arts. It's probably the newest and fastest growing sport in the world, and it is just that. It's a mixed martial arts. You've got wrestling, you've got jiu-jitsu, you've got boxing, you've got kickboxing, you've got Muay Thai, you've got judo, you've got so many disciplines all under the same category of mixed martial arts. But most of all nowadays, you have a mixed martial artist, somebody that is good at all of these disciplines, and they've become a solid all-round fighter and an amazing athlete. So if you're a mixed martial artist, you want to compete at the very highest level in the world, and the very highest level in the world and the biggest company in the world is the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Now, there's a massive history that goes behind the UFC, and it's about 22 and a half years old now, and I'm not going to go into great detail about the main history of the UFC, because it's quite complicated, but they're the guys that kind of morph this mixed martial arts into what it is today. Now, as this is the first show, I'm not going to go into mass detail and give you loads and loads of information and make your head explode in any kind of way, because it is a lot to learn. So what I'm suggesting is that you look on the internet, you look for a documentary, a very brilliant documentary that was made. And in this documentary, it has the full history of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC, and how MMA became what it is today. This documentary is called Fighting for a Generation, the UFC, 20 Years in the Making. Okay, so if you look for that, 20 years in the making, fighting for a generation, you will find this documentary. It's about an hour and a half long. It's a brilliant documentary, and in this documentary you will see and get used to certain people's faces and names that you're going to hear a lot over the next coming weeks, next coming shows. So let's start at the very, very top. The president of the UFC is Dana White. Now, Dana White is, if anything, the biggest Ultimate Fighting Championship fan and mixed martial arts fan in the world. You will never see any other person more passionate about what he does and the sport that he promotes than Dana White. I recommend you type Dana White into YouTube, watch some of his interviews about how he talks and how he describes fighters and fights and events. You'll get to know that Dana White doesn't talk or take any shit. He loves his product, he loves his sport, and I quite admire Dana White for the person that he is. And he's one of those people that I'd like to have at a dinner party. You know, if you could pick 5 people at a dinner party, Dana White's definitely one of them. I just love to spend some time with him and talk about fights. The next person is the chairman of the UFC, which is Lorenzo Fertitta, and his brother Frank Fertitta Jr., who is they're both chairmen of the company Zuffa, who are the sister company, the parent company of the UFC. Now, these 3 guys, the Fertitta brothers, Frank and Lorenzo, and Dana White, they took over the company, the UFC, and turned it to what it is today. So if you watch that documentary, you'll get to see how they took over the company and how they transformed it to what it is today. It wasn't an easy task, but they did an amazing job, and I personally would say, and they will say as well, that the UFC is now the biggest and one of the most recognised franchises in the world. They're bigger than the New York Yankees, I'd say, and they're definitely bigger than Manchester United Football Club, which people know is a massive, massive franchise, but they're bigger than all of that. Now, another person that's quite important to the UFC is a little guy. His name is Joe Silva. Now, Joe Silva has a great, great job, and he's an absolute genius. He is the matchmaker who makes the fights, okay? So he makes the fights and chooses which fighter is going to go against which fighter, and the man is an absolute genius. Now, other familiar faces that you're going to see on this documentary, and just in general UFC programming, is the color commentators, the play-by-play guys, the voices you'll get used to them, is Mike Goldberg and a guy called Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan is also a podcaster. Listen to his podcast, check him out. He's brilliant. He's a comedian. He's excellent. But if anything, he's such a passionate guy about mixed martial arts. He's a jiu-jitsu expert himself. He's a hell of an athlete. So what he says and how he comes across and how much he loves fights is very adamant and very clear in his work as a commentator. And he also does the interviews after the fight. So you'll get to see that Joe Rogan absolutely loves the sport just as much as anybody and deserves to be there. Then you've got the guy who's doing the announcing in the ring with his very famous voice. That is Bruce Buffer. You'll get to hear him. He's brilliant. He hypes up the fights. He makes the fighters get really hyped up. He's excellent. So the announcer is Bruce Buffer. And there's a lot of referees in the world of mixed martial arts, but probably the most famous one is Big John McCarthy. Now, he's the most famous one is because he helped come up with some of the rules, and he's been there since UFC number 2. Okay, we've now, at the time of recording this, UFC 190 has just been. So he's been there from the very, very beginning. He's very important to the UFC, I would say. And he's a great, great referee. There are other famous referees. There's Herb Dean and Mario Yamazaki. There's a great referee from Britain who's called Mark Goddard, who's a brilliant referee. But enough about the referees, because there's loads of them, and you'll get to notice them, you'll get to see who you think's a really good referee anyway. There's always a lot of speculation about who's the best referee in the world, so that's one of those big debates. So that's some of the names that we're going to hear quite a lot over the next few weeks and the next few shows. And when you're watching the UFC product, you'll get to see the faces, you'll get to recognise the names, and therefore understand a bit more about what each of them do for the UFC. Now, over the next coming weeks, we'll be talking about the weight classes, the rules of combat inside the octagon, because that's what they call the cage. It's not called a cage, it's the octagon, the world-famous octagon. We'll go over the rules, because the rules have adapted over many years now, so there's lots of things you can do and you can't do. It's not like what it used to be advertised as, there are no rules, the only way to leave is to die and blah, blah, blah. There's plenty of rules now. It's a proper sanctioned sport, which is very safe for fighters to compete in. going back to the documentary again, the Fighting for the Generations, 20 years in the making of the UFC, you'll get to see that at the beginning there was no rules and it wasn't that safe, and how the sport adapted over the 22 years that we are now at, into becoming what it is today, which is just, I love it. I personally have the feeling that boxing is on the decline now because of how good the UFC is. Because there's a fight every week nearly. Now you don't get that in boxing. You don't get a mainstream fight in boxing every week. You get one or two a year that are quite big. Over in Britain you get a little bit more. But UFC, it's like every week, and it's not just in like Las Vegas, which is the fight capital of the world, which you're going to hear a lot about Las Vegas. A lot of events are held there, but it's all over the world. The UFC, they have events everywhere. I've actually been lucky enough to go to one live. I went to UFC 120 in the Millennium. No, not the bloody Millennium Dome. Yeah, the Millennium Dome. It used to be called the Millennium Dome. The O2 Arena. That's it. In that London. I went down there to watch UFC 120, Michael Bisping versus Akiyama. It was an absolutely amazing event. Enough about that. I've gone right off trail now. I can't remember what I was talking about. So as I was saying, it's a massive global brand now, the UFC, and they're all over the world. So on every show, what I'm going to do, depending on what kind of, if you've not watched UFC before, or you are a fan, you've been watching a few events, and if you ever need any help or any questions, or you want to watch any fights, any historic fights or any really good fights, let me know. Send me a message on Twitter. It's @PodcastEnhancer, or any other way through the podcast hub. It'll get to me. I've also got an email. It's podcastenhancer@gmail.com. Send me a message. I'll let you know any information you need. I can put you in the right direction if I can't. But every week I'll tell you or advise to watch something every week if you want to or if you can. So this week it's definitely going to be that documentary, the 20 years in the making, Fighting for the Generation documentary. It's about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and 30 minutes long. It's really good. It will cover most things I've talked about today, and through that you will actually see other fights, and you'll see a bit of information that you're gonna like. You're gonna get to see some of the old UFC, which was a bit shambolic to be honest, and you'll get to see certain events that were historic, which will lead you on to The Ultimate Fighter. Now, The Ultimate Fighter Season 1 was the changing of the guard. It was what made the UFC legitimately big, and it changed everything, and it made it a global product. Now, you'll see it on the documentary. The Season 1, if you can get a chance to watch it, watch the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, or Tough One. You'll love it. The fight changed the landscape of it all. It's a great fight. I can still watch it to this day. It's a brilliant fight. It's got Forrest Griffin versus Stephen Bonner. It's a 3-round war, one of the most important wars, the most important fight in UFC history, to be honest. So you'll watch that and enjoy that. And it also goes through a couple of other events. And UFC 100 is marked on there as well on that documentary. A great show. Brock Lesnar was the main event. Now, if you guys who are listening to my shows, obviously I work for a wrestling show as well, you know that I know a lot about Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar was just a different animal, and the only person to go back and forth between UFC and WWE. So that's very important, the UFC 100. We're on one, as I'm filming this one, UFC 191 is next. So we're only like 9 events away from UFC 200. So that's how quick the sport is growing now. Because the UFC have had over 300 events now with fight nights and pay-per-views. See, that's the other question I get asked. What's the difference between a pay-per-view, like a UFC 190 event, or a fight night? Now, the difference is, in this country, is nothing. We still get them on BT Sport in the UK, and we're still watching the same way. But in America, if it's a numbered pay-per-view like UFC 190 we just had, that's a pay-per-view in America, whereas the fight nights are on a channel called Fox Sport, which obviously we don't get. So that's what the difference is between the two. Mainly, you probably get 1 or 2, maybe 3, sometimes once a week in certain areas and certain times of the year. Once a week you get a decent UFC event. They're all really good. I haven't missed one in about 6 years. And because of the time difference, I have to get up early and watch them in the morning, about 3 in the morning in the UK, depending on where they are in America, of course, because I record them anyway automatically, but I get too excited and I just can't wait to watch them in the morning. So the big events I get up for. So if you're ever on the Twitter at 3 o'clock in the morning watching UFC, check out Podcast Enhancer, and I'm on the Twitter. More than happy to talk to you about UFC. Oh, wow.